Off the bat, I have to say that having a narcissistic parent doesn't mean that you're going to develop schizoid traits, and not all people with schizoid traits have narcissistic parents. I'm going to go through some of the ways that having a narcissistic parent can impact schizoid development, and to make the point that primary and secondary schizoids may be affected in slightly different ways, but in any case, having a narcissistic parent is going to cause difficulties in the process of growing up, developing, and also functioning within relationships. With primary schizoids, we develop schizoid traits as a consequence of sensitivity very early. So we don't get to the point whereby we are drawn towards bonding and forming relationships. So in that sense, having a narcissistic parent isn't going to be as much of an emotional loss as it is to somebody who is more drawn towards emotional bonding and then suffers a lack of emotional support. In primary schizoids who have narcissistic parents or a primary caregiver that's narcissistic, there's going to be some residue of a time where they may have wanted to emotionally connect with their parent or receive emotional support from their parent, but that support wasn't forthcoming, after which they were left with no option but to emotionally withdraw. One of the main ways that having a narcissistic parent impacts or anybody's development, but this is specifically towards schizoids, is that we're not going to have the mirroring that we require to get to know ourselves better. And this is because with a lot of narcissists, they tend to be very self-obsessed, and their needs are always considered to be greater than other people's needs. So taking the time to get to understand the child, taking the time to get to learn about the child's needs isn't something that's going to be a priority. Narcissists often see their children as extensions of themselves, and so there can be a lot of intrusion in a sense of manipulating the child to be the way that they see the child should be, or the way they see their child should be. And this means not allowing the child to be themselves, express themselves, or fully develop along their own path. Narcissistic parents vary. Some are more intrusive than others. Some can be very bossy and overbearing. Some can be neglectful, taking care of their own needs, wants, desires, and not really too much having constant interaction with the child. So there is variance in how much a narcissistic parent will have an influence or will want to be an influence in their child's life. I think that a problem with having a narcissistic parent is that there are going to be times when they're going to have like narcissistic rages, and there's nothing really that can be done to avoid that. For some children, they will try to adopt their behavior to try to avoid the rage, and this can mean trying to stay out of the way, making themselves small, trying not to be noticed, and this is something that can feed into the development of schizoid traits. For the primary schizoids who start off with more of a natural pull towards wanting to be alone from the start due to sensory issues with sensory stimulation and needing to be in a quiet space most of the time in order to function more optimally, because noisy environments can throw the mind off and can make it more difficult to function. For the primary schizoids, it's going to be a case that when having a narcissistic parent, that it can be a lot of disturbance to the environment. So where they want to keep the environment very still and quiet, having a narcissistic parent can definitely get in the way of that, because they're going to shape the environment to suit themselves, and they're not going to really take into consideration the needs of the individual to have a quiet place or a stable environment with which to operate. So this can mean sometimes really growing up in unsuitable environments that's not adapted to our needs. In any case, the environment, whether you're primary or secondary, isn't going to be adapted to your needs. In many ways, it makes sense that when a person can't connect with their parent because their parent is self-obsessed and doesn't recognize them as an individual in their own right, that there isn't really anywhere else to go but within, because there's no connection to be made outside of the self with the parent. I think that for a lot of schizoids, being alone within themselves, not having a primary caregiver that can be connected with, though it can be the case that if one primary caregiver is a narcissist, the other one most likely won't be, so there could be potential support from the non-narcissistic parent. But in many cases, because the individual has turned within and do feel alone and has been pushed towards self-sufficiency because the adequate or appropriate support isn't available from parents or the parent, the narcissistic parent, that getting out of the environment as soon or as early as possible is usually something that they want to do. And because they're used to being self-sufficient, it's going to be easier to make that adaptation from childhood to adulthood, in a sense of being in an environment with parents and then being in an environment without parents, because the plan is to get away from the narcissistic parent, to be alone in peace. It's not going to be easy necessarily to navigate through the world because, money, resources. However, if a person has developed self-sufficiency from an early age, it'll be easier for them than for somebody who hasn't developed self-sufficiency from an early age. In general, to sum it up, I'd say that having a narcissistic parent means that there is not any potential for a healthy relationship to develop or a mutually respectful relationship to develop. And there isn't any potential for an individual to be truly seen or heard. So it makes sense why having a narcissistic parent can contribute towards someone developing schizoid traits. Schizoid traits can be developed under various different conditions. A person can have two parents that are fine, no problem, and still develop schizoid traits, especially in the case of primary schizoids. And also, there are parents who have other types of maybe personality disorders, problems, might have depression. There can be other reasons why a child's needs aren't taken care of other than having a narcissistic parent. But in this video, I just wanted to just bring up some points about how having a narcissistic parent can have a negative impact on a person's development, and in especially how it can contribute towards the formation of schizoid traits.